And welcome back to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, and joining me as always is Shayne Kubas. The Steelers have just fallen short of a playoff berth, and it was so close. I can't believe the circumstances that almost worked out in the final 2 weeks of the 2022 season for the Steelers to make it into the playoffs, and our fate rested in Joe Flacco, and he could not pull through for us. Dolphins beat the Jets 6-9. The last minute field goal, and that essentially eliminated the Steelers, even though they took care of business on their own end. So Shane and I are going to recap Pittsburgh's season. We're going to talk about we're going to give our grades for each position this week, and then we're going to talk about the Diontae Johnson a little bit here too. Johnson's showing up a little bit in the news, and not the first time for him. I don't know what to make. But I'm going to ask you that, Shane. I want to see what you think. Let's start off with recapping the Steelers and Browns game. I mean, we couldn't have asked for much more, I don't think, than what we saw since the bye week from the Steelers. Finished the season 7-2, and I think a pretty strong overall game against Cleveland in the season finale. They won 28-14. I think it was a pretty good team effort all around. Who do you have as the winners in this game, Shane?
I think for me, when it comes to winners, like you have to look at the pass rush first. I mean, they just dominated, especially the second half of the game, made Deshaun Watson really difficult to just make it really difficult for him to do anything, especially in the second half and down the stretch. George Pickens had a great game. He should have had another catch, in my opinion. I think they should have definitely reviewed that 20-yarder on the sideline. Then the secondary play, kind of part with the pass rush. I mean, they kind of go together, obviously, as well, but 2 interceptions, big plays by the secondary in certain situations. And just overall, I think the defense won the day for sure, and the offense just kind of obliged down the stretch of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. That secondary, they showed up big time. Cam Hayward, as always. I mean, he's been a staple, consistent, so consistent. And then, like you alluded to already, George Pickens. I mean, throw the guy the ball when he's not open. He's open. Throw him the football because good things happen. And I agree with you. I think that one should have been challenged. That Tomlin missed the challenge in that game. It's kind of the story with Tomlin a little bit. It resulted in a fumble, and at the time, I can kind of understand. I mean, you were inches away from the goal line, but in my mind, I'm thinking, just QB sneak. If you do a QB sneak twice in a row, there's no way that they are going to be able to stop you from scoring. And so I think they overthought it just a little bit there. I know that Najee is going to get that 9 times out of 10, jumping over the pile there, but he ended up fumbling. Luckily, it didn't cost the Steelers the game, but it would have made it so theoretically the Steelers would have won 35-14 instead of 28-14, which would have been a nice score. But as it stands, not many 30-point performances from the Steelers as of late, since dating back to a few years from now. So what about your losers from the season finale, Shane?
I mean, the run defense, even though it didn't matter because the Browns did not establish the run really, which is still kind of confusing me, but it's the Browns. What are you going to do, I guess? The run defense wasn't great on a per carry basis, especially. They let Deshaun Watson get away a lot of times, which that's partly on the pass rush, but there's a lot of running lanes for Chubb at times and for Watson, which that has shown up at times for the Steelers. Overall, their run defense ranking isn't bad, but definitely had some rough outings. Mark Robinson, I know he's a young player. He had some ugly plays in this game. It was pretty gross. Some of the plays, that missed sack, the missed tackle on Chubb in the open field, like you could tell he's a guy whose his aggressiveness could serve him well, but he also needs to kind of learn to play a little bit more, I think, still, which hopefully he will. And then Diontae Johnson, man, I mean, 10 targets, 2 catches. I mean, this has been the story, unfortunately, this year. And we've talked about it a lot. It's not all his fault. There's definitely some aspects of the offense. And, Kenny was off target for a lot of this game at times until kind of the second half rolled around. But it's ugly when you look at his per target numbers, his yards per catch, his, no touchdowns on the season, broke the record for most catches in the season without a touchdown. Like, again, it was rough for him this year, and we'll talk about him more later. But it was not a great end of the end of the season for him, at least.
Yeah, I mean, if you point to a bigger loser in this game, I don't know how you can say any other name than Diontae Johnson. I know that Robinson wasn't good; he only played 11 snaps. So he's pretty limited. Yeah, and that's why. Yeah, exactly. He was not good in coverage, and I don't think he's ever going to be that guy. Like you're hoping for like the Vince Williams type that can come downhill and hit somebody in the hole. That's more his game. But Johnson was just miserable in this contest. And it pains me to say that because I wanted to see progress from him. The Steelers paid him. He's one of the highest paid players on the team. But when you're catching 2 of 10 targets, and some of them weren't his fault, there was at least 1 batted at the line of scrimmage.
Might have been 2, actually. Yeah, it might have been 2.
I think it could have been 2 to Johnson. And then one was air-mailed, I remember. But still 3 drops. I mean, depending on how you want to count these drops, there's at least 2, probably 3 drops in this game from Diontae Johnson. The one was it was almost a fumble, and if not a fumble, then a drop. And so just not good at all. Finished the season with 86 catches without a touchdown, 147 targets without a touchdown. That's record breaking in a very bad way. You want to be able to convert and pay dirt. And Johnson was just, sadly, he was one of the least efficient starting receivers in the NFL this year. Steelers quarterbacks had a 50 passer rating when throwing to him. In comparison, 109 passer rating when throwing to George Pickens. Big difference. Again, some of it's not his fault. Some of it is the play design, but we saw a lot of going backwards this year from Diontae Johnson. Literally, after the catch, we saw a lot of the drop stuff come back. So I think it was probably, unfortunately, this was probably the most inconsistent season of his career, even more so than his rookie campaign where he dropped the ball an awful lot as well. And so not what you want to see, not how we wanted the season to end for him. But outside of that, it's really hard to point to a lot of other losers from this game for me. I think the offensive line did a pretty good job overall against, same with the running backs. I think that the defense had a strong performance overall, 7 sacks by this unit. Watt was often double teamed and even triple teamed at times. And so the fact that they were able to get after Watson so much and make him force him out of the pocket, I thought they did a really good job there. Defensive arrow, I think, is pointing way up heading into the offseason, although certainly some holes that are going to have to be addressed for sure. One big injury in this game, potentially very big, at least what we thought it so at the time, was Pat Freiermuth. And he goes down, and I watched that play over and over again. I couldn't figure out what exactly happened to his left knee, but he goes down in pain, and he was grasping that knee. They cut to a commercial break, and by the time we come back, he's hobbling off the field with 2 men helping him on both sides. And so I feared ACL. I am the victim of an ACL injury myself several years back. And so I remember the feeling. And I couldn't stand on it afterwards. And so, and sometimes you can, even with a tear. Fortunately, it was deemed that Freiermuth has a sprained MCL, ACL. And so that we're talking months instead of half a year recovery time. And so that's a big difference between the two. We look at an example last year would be like Michael Gallup of the Dallas Cowboys, who tore his ACL very late in the season. I think is either the last game of the season or the game before the last. And he was not ready to play by the following year. He had to start the season on IR. And when we did come back this year, it's probably the worst season that he's had so far. And so that would have been a major setback this late in the season for potentially the best player or most consistent player that the Steelers have on offense. And he's just a dynamic player, weapon for them. And very fortunate that they avoided catastrophe there, because you don't want to have to start the first 3, 5, 4, or 6 games, however long it ends up being, without Freiermuth. There'll have been at least 4 if they have to start him on IR. So they're definitely able to avoid that there. And he should be on track to return for minicamp.
Yeah.
Sure. So what should fans be encouraged by, Shane, as we wrap up the 2022 season, look ahead into the offseason? I mean, is there anything that's most encouraging?
I think the way this team responded to adversity this year, because they're not used to 2-6, 3-7. Like, they're just not used to it. And, you know, a lot of the players on this team are young, and they just haven't been playing with the Steelers very long in general, so they might not be as accustomed to winning like Cam Hayward and TJ Watt, some of those guys are used to. But still, while they've been here, they've never experienced that type of season, really. I mean, the season of 2019 was weird just because Ben got hurt, and obviously they had a rough start then, but they quickly picked it up there. To be halfway through the season and to be completely out of the picture, like no chance at all for the playoffs, and get to the point where all it took was Joe Flacco not being bad to get into the playoffs, you like to see that out of this team. And also, you're encouraged by the way Kenny Pickett finished down the stretch. And the numbers really weren't there, like as far as your touchdowns, ton of yards, but with this offense, it wasn't going to happen. So seeing him play well down the stretch, Pickens play well down the stretch when given opportunity to play, that's really important. And the one thing I will say that you shouldn't be encouraged by is if Canada is on this team still as an offensive coordinator going into next year. That could kind of kill most of the encouragement I just talked about. But assuming that change is made, and even if it doesn't happen, as long as they build around, Pickett the right way, there's still going to be a lot to be excited about moving into next year.
Yeah, I know a lot of fans were really disappointed when Black Monday came and went, and Matt Canada still has a job. And it wasn't unexpected. We know how the Steelers do business. We know the words that Mike Tomlin was going to say in that postseason press conference there. And so I know that fans are still holding out hope that Canada is not back. But as of now, that's not something that we can really look forward to for the time being. But I agree with what you said there. Fans have to be pleased with at least the first couple selections of the Steelers in the 2022 NFL draft with Kenny Pickett, George Pickens. I think that is going to be the future for a while here. Both showed a lot of promise. In respect to their positions, Pickens perhaps even more, just because the guy catches everything that you throw at him. And then Kenny Pickett down the stretch. I mean, if you don't count the Ravens game in the second half of the season, week 14, the game that he threw one pass, it was deflected at the line of scrimmage, and Trubisky came in through the hat trick, 3 interceptions.
Yeah.
If you don't count that game, Kenny Pickett was 7-1 to close out the year, and that's not bad. Even with what many would call a cupcake schedule, that's great for a rookie. And he was doing everything that he needed to do to get the job done, including 4 come from behind fourth quarter touchdown drives this year, which actually tied Ben Roethlisberger's for his season most. So that's impressive, I think. Definitely looking forward to that. And perhaps more than anything else right now, Shane, at least in my mind, because we just missed the season, I'm looking forward to the offseason, what's to come. Man, I am thrilled that the Steelers were able to just absolutely fleece the Bears in that trade for what's going to be the 32nd selection. They're going to call it the 33rd pick because technically the Dolphins pick is called as forfeited. It's going to be the 32nd overall selection in the NFL draft for Chase Claypool. That's a valuable pick because at the end of the first round, when that day closes and wraps up, and that's when teams are going to be in discussions with Pittsburgh about maybe moving up if there's a quarterback that fell out of the first round or whatever else that they need. There's going to be lots of trade talks there. And so the Steelers are going to have a whole day to sit on that and weigh their options of what they want to do with that pick. If they haven't already used it, maybe potentially to move up into the draft. And so with Andy Weidl here, it's kind of exciting to see which direction the Steelers are going to go in the draft this year. So yeah, there's definitely reasons to be encouraged. And I will say as well, I was looking at like the mainstream like power rankings following the season here. Most of them, NBC Sports, Yahoo, they all had the Steelers between like the 11th and 13th or 14th best team. That's a good way to close the season. Even if they didn't make the playoffs, at least a lot of people were viewing them as a playoff caliber team by that point. Yeah. So the arrow was pointing up for sure. I mean, we had one of the youngest offenses in the NFL, rookie quarterback. And so we have to imagine it's going to get better. Lots of draft capital to work with this year. And so we'll see who ends up returning. And that'll be for a different podcast. We're definitely going to break down all the Steelers free agents and all the signings they could potentially make this year. So let's switch gears here for a second, Shane, and let's talk about Diontae Johnson showing up in the news these last couple of days here. And I don't know how much to read into it. And Johnson's done things like this, similar things in the past when he was waiting and kind of holding in for his contract. But 2 days ago, Diontae Johnson sent out kind of a cryptic tweet on Twitter, and basically indicating that something big was coming, right? So after that, and people are speculating at what that might be. That some thought that, well, maybe it's a personnel change. Maybe it's Matt Canada's gone and he's happy about that. I don't know. We don't know why receivers tweet out the things that they do. It's hard to tell. But then just today, Shane, it became public and people putting out on Twitter, taking screenshots that Johnson had unfollowed the Steelers on social media. And so that one's a little bit interesting. And some were saying that he's done this in the past. I don't know. I haven't been keeping track of that really. But what do you make of all of this? Like, should we be reading into any of it at all? Is it all just smoke? And if it is just smoke, Shane, then why is Johnson doing some of these things that he's doing right now?
I think it's hard to say just because, again, Diontae is a bit of an eccentric guy, you can tell. And a lot of receivers are. I mean, it's kind of, I feel like to play receiver and to think you're the best, it does come with a certain quality of person, which can be good or bad depending on who you ask, obviously. But I think with him, it's probably a combination of two things. He's probably frustrated with the season he had. He obviously wanted to play better than he did. I think he's frustrated with the way the offense was handled. I think he's frustrated by really just everything to do with how the season played out for him personally and for the offense overall, even though it did get better down the stretch. And I also think that he knows that with the way he played and the numbers he put up, there is the potential that the Steelers could look at it and say, hey, we don't want to pay this guy this much money. Maybe we can move off of him in some way. And I think he's kind of preparing for that in the sense that he knows he might not be long for this team, depending on what direction the team wants to go in the offseason.
Yeah, I think that is, I mean, of the scenarios that could kind of be playing out right here, Johnson has no leverage at this point.
No,
He's
he
got his
doesn't.
contract, he's got his guaranteed money. The Steelers have the leverage in what to do with him, although a trade would be difficult because if a trade happens before the June 1st, the Steelers would eat $11.6 million of dead cap money, which makes it tricky. However, the team receiving Johnson, they would pay just $7.5 million annually, and for a receiver as productive as him, they would be more than willing to do that, considering the prices that players go for in the free agent market. And so, maybe it's worth it to them to absorb a big cap hit if it means they're getting a second round pick back for Diontae Johnson. Although for sure you're going to have to go back and invest back in the receiver position because you'd be down to just George Pickens essentially on the team. And so I don't know if that's what's going on. I have no idea. I don't want to speculate too much here, but it seems like there could be something to it. And again, like I said, Johnson has no leverage in this. And so if a decision is coming on the part of the Steelers.
Yes.
When you have 880 some yards on 147 targets, I mean, in some cases that might be a cuttable offense. If you had a really deep roster and you were that inefficient, but obviously receivers a valued position. Teams keep 4 to 6 of them on the roster every year. And Johnson has a place. He certainly has a place. I don't think that he'll be as inefficient next year. I don't think that we'll see a Johnson that's as inefficient as we saw from him this season. But at the very least, if Johnson's here and he's here to stay, then he needs to kind of knock some of this stuff off and stop unfollowing the team and stop with the cryptic messages and just focus on football and getting a little bit more efficient at his game, honing in on his craft. Because I'm telling you what, I don't think the Steelers should target him 100 times in a season, let alone 147, if this is the results that you're going to get out of it. And again, some of that has to do with Matt Canada, but we'll see what happens there. Very interesting situation, I feel like, to say the least. Shane, what would be your preference? If you could do anything with Johnson right now, do you keep him? Do you trade him? Obviously, you don't cut the guy, but do you keep or trade Johnson is basically what it comes down to. Would you be willing to absorb that big dead cap number if it meant that you're getting, say, a second round pick out of Johnson?
I think honestly, for me, just because I really value the skill set that he does have as a route runner and a separator, I think that in the right system, you can make him a very, very efficient receiver with a lower target share and, again, just a better offensive system around him. So ideally, I'd like to keep him at his salary because as much as he's getting paid a significant amount of money, and especially after this offseason, it's going to be considered nothing receiver position. It already kind of is because of how much money these receivers are getting paid now. So I'd rather have a guy like Johnson than not have him, especially assuming we can, like I said, get a different offensive scheme in there, get a different offensive mind. Kenny Pickett's going to improve as well, his game. And ideally, that's what I want to happen. But if a team is willing to give up enough, I'd still want maybe a pick next year. Wait till after June 1st where the cap hit won't be as much of a dead cap hit at that point. And maybe wait and see kind of how you can address receiver in the offseason, whether it's in the draft or maybe you can bring in somebody who can be a quality 2, let Pickens be the true one, which I think is what we all want anyway. That's going to be based on, I think, how the offseason plays out. But I don't expect anything to happen until at least after the draft, probably.
Yeah, and it's another reason why we'd like to see Matt Canada gone. And I think that Johnson's efficiency would take a huge boost forward. Not that he'll ever, I don't think that we should ever expect Johnson to be that number 1 receiver anymore. At this point, I think that he's kind of leveled off as that number 2, and he was a more consistent number 2 in the previous year.
Yes.
But again, I think that dynamic has to shift. We need to see a paradigm shift in terms of the target share in Pittsburgh. And I think a lot of that has to do with the routes that are being run. A lot of these plays are designed to go to Johnson and with very few people in line for targets, whereas Pickens is running down the field on go routes and back shoulders and comebacks. And those aren't as easy passes to throw to, and you're not going to throw as often in that situation. But something has to change. The efficiency has to get better here. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with Johnson this year. I don't know. I don't know what this is all about right now. I don't know if it's leading up to something. And it's worth mentioning as well that this is not Kevin Colbert's team anymore. And the Colbert that kind of just sits back, lets things unfold, and just does the routine process in the draft and free agency. We've got Omar Khan. We've got Andy Weidel as the assistant GM. And so these guys could be much more open perhaps to making some different moves that we haven't seen in the past. What I will say, though, is it's really hard to want to trade away the player who ranked out as the #1 separator in the NFL, according to ESPN's analytics, even if he was inefficient, because it's such a valuable trait to have, especially for a young quarterback. And if you get rid of Johnson, you need to find somebody else to replace him that has probably a very similar skill set. Like maybe what they'd have to do is take that 2nd round pick, package it with another, and go and try to get a Jordan Addison or someone in the draft who could fill a very similar type role. It seems a little bit counterintuitive if they were kind of doing that just to replace Johnson, unless you were getting a significant upgrade on a much cheaper deal. The deal would obviously be cheaper, but there's no guarantee that the receiver you draft is going to be as good or better than what Diontae has been for the Steelers. Obviously, again, not a good year, 50 some pass rating when thrown to. It's not ideal, but I don't expect this to be the trend. I think it's going to go up, even if he just levels out as like an average #2 receiver. Any other thoughts, Shane, on Diontae Johnson?
Really, again, it's just you have to take advantage of what he does well, and they didn't do that to the best of their ability this year. And I think, again, it comes down to Canada and his scheme and what he's trying to do. It's just, it's too oversimplified in certain cases, and there's too many just, outbreaking routes to the outside. Like the comeback routes are great because he always seems to win on those routes. But again, at some point you have to use him in a more effective way, and it allows him to have more run after catch opportunity, actual true open space, because we've seen whenever he thinks he has to make people miss, he goes backwards for some reason every time. Like, give him a true just lane to run with. And I think that there was moments where you saw that this year, but it's just the offense didn't hit them. And that has to change if he's going to be on the team next year. And really, in general, no matter who ends up being the #2 receiver or the top receiver next year, they have to be able to scheme them open better.
Yeah, 100%. Need more slants and drags and way less of those speed rollouts, because I mean, those irk me so bad, because the max potential of those plays is like 4 to 6 yards. Like you're leading the receiver to the sideline with a defensive back over top. And so you would have to be able to stop on a dime and cut back the other direction if you want any yard after the catch opportunity. And that's my biggest pet peeve about Canada's offense. I think their route concepts are horrible, and they don't allow receivers to work after the catch, which is such a big thing. And again, that's going to help out Pickett. That's going to jack up his yards per attempt. So instead of being at 6 point something, he might be able to jump up to the mid 7s. And that makes a big difference for the success of an offense. So anyway, we'll see what happens with Johnson here. I don't expect any news to be coming anytime soon, but it'll be interesting to see if the Steelers do anything with him at all this offseason. All right, if you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Still Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all your support. All right, Shane, we are going to give our positional grades for the Pittsburgh Steelers during the 2022 season. Lots of different opinions, I think, can come from some of these. And it depends, because the season was kind of a tale of two halves, right?
Yes,
we had the first half, the Steelers started 2-6. The last half, they finished 7-2. That bye was like the perfect break in the middle to separate. It also, Shane, probably separated the hard schedule from the easy schedule as well. So that's something to be factored in. But let's go ahead and start with the quarterback position. A combination of Mitch Trubisky and Kenny Pickett this year. Obviously, not very much success with Trubisky. I think he was 2-3 as a starter, 2-4 if you count the Ravens game, which he played almost the whole game, with the exception of the first 2 drives. So how would you grade? What grade would you give to the quarterbacks this year for Steelers?
I think a C- overall. And I say C- because I'd give Trubisky a D and I'd give Pickett a C. I think Pickett was, especially when you factor in everything, he played like an average NFL quarterback, which as a rookie is not a bad thing by any means, but there was definitely a tale of two halves for him as well. For the most part, his efficiency, his ability to avoid turnovers, that all got better in the second half of the year against less, stiff competition, but still a lot of things to like with what he showed. So I give him a C. And then Trubisky was who I kind of expected him to be, where if you ask him to do very little, he'll do that very little just fine. If you ask him to do too much, he does way too much. So there's kind of that dichotomy with him, but overall I'll give him a C- for their performance on the air.
Yeah. I think if we were looking at this, like from everything before week 10, I mean, an F is not out of the question for how bad it was early on. Like D- I'm going to go a little bit different with you here, Shane. I'm going to go with the C+. And I think that's because we've got the game-winning drives from Pickett. Yeah. And I think that I'm going to give him the quarterbacks a little bit of grace here too, because I think that for the most part, especially Pickett in the second half of the year, he executed Canada's game plan. Yeah. That's not ever going to come with gaudy numbers. He's not going to have the 300 passing yards, 2 or 3 touchdowns. I mean, he's performing well, but he's getting 168 yards, 180 some yards doing it. And again, I don't necessarily think that's his fault, because when the game plan is I'm going to run the football 40 plus times, I'm going to play great ball control offense, good defense, and I'm going to make sure my quarterback doesn't turn the ball over, which is exactly what Pickett did. He only turned the ball over once in the second half of the season, which was great. So I'm going to give it a little bit higher than you there. I'm going to go C+ at the quarterback position. I want it to climb. It needs to climb. If the Steelers want to be contenders, it has to get better. And I think all around it, they've got to get better in the red zone. The numbers, if the numbers improve, it means the Steelers are probably it means that the max potential for the offense is probably increasing, right? It's not just I'm running between the tackles and I'm stalling out in the red zone. And so that's where they need to work on. I'm going to go C+ for the quarterbacks this year for the Steelers. All right, running back, Shane, what grade do you have for us?
I got a B. I think that Warren was a great find as an undrafted free agent. I'm excited to see what he does moving forward as kind of the backup, top backup for Najee. And when you look at Najee, once he started to actually look like the player that he was, built to be athletically and everything else, once he seemed healthy. I know he said he wasn't hurt, but we kind of all know, I think at this point, that he definitely was banged up for a lot of the year. Once he got going and was fully healthy, the broken tackles were happening, yards after contact, his ability to get to the edge and actually win on the edge there, opposed to getting tackled behind the line of scrimmage, all that started to show up. And obviously there was a high volume of carries, so his yards per carry wasn't super spectacular. But if you look at it from the first 4 or 5 games moving forward, he was a way different player. And I think they really were the engine of the offense, especially with how much Canada wanted to run the football.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with you here, Shane. I've also got a B for the running backs. And you talked about Najee. He did tell me in that interview that he wasn't injured, but again, I mean, what's he going to say? Yeah, I'm banged up. So I didn't expect anything less from him in that response. And he was clearly a different player in the second half of the season. Now, again, I'm a big proponent of the running game goes as the offensive line goes. And we're going to get the offensive line here in just a little bit, but I think that had a lot to do with it. Well, as those guys improved, so did the running game. I thought Najee had a terrific second half of the season. And if he plays a whole season sample like that, then I'm pleased. I'm not first round pleased with him, Shane. Don't get me wrong.
I know.
But I'm second round pleased with him, and good enough where it's the pick isn't going to bother me so badly because of the inefficiency. So I did like what I saw from him. I love what I saw from Jaylen Warren. I mean, as in terms of expectations, obviously expectations are high for Najee. They're extremely low for Warren. People didn't even know if he was going to make the team this year. But when you average 5.5 yards a carry and extremely efficient as a pass catcher, I was pleased with what they got out of the combination of both those guys. And I like the balance that they were kind of getting by the end of the season. Just that 1-2 punch, the thunder and lightning, if you will, a little bit there. And neither of them were great testing athletes in terms of like top end speed. Najee didn't run, but he wouldn't have tested well in that regard. But Warren definitely has got a little bit of juice to get to that outside. You can see he can get to the edge and kind of make something happen there. And so want to see more 20-yard runs for sure, because the explosive play rate was very, very low this year. But in terms of like the 10-yard runs, 15-yard runs, those really picked up in the second half of the season. So something to be thankful for. Shane and I got a B on the running backs. Let's go ahead and move to the wide receivers, Shane.
So I have a C+, mostly because if you look outside of Pickens, it's a bit rough. And I give them a C+ because they are obviously, kind of hampered by the offense and the way that we were running. You can't look just at the production. You're not going to get much out of them if you just look at production. But I think that Johnson, despite his issues, was able to at least, be semi-productive at times. He had a few games that were really good. Pickens, when given the opportunity, was also very good as well. And then the backup receivers, they did their role. Sims had a few big plays as kind of the de facto third receiver after Claypool was traded to the Bears. And when Claypool was on the team, he was definitely inefficient in his own right, so he had his issues. But overall, I think it was a decent year for them considering the circumstances, but they didn't really exceed past what they probably should have done just based on the offensive scheme. So I'll give them a C+.
Yeah, I'm going to go a little bit lower, Shane. I got a C- for the Steelers receivers. And I think that, it is essentially just George Pickens salvaging that grade, which would otherwise be, maybe a D- because I wasn't pleased with the inefficiency of Diontae. He did have a couple really good games mixed in there, some really nice and important catches. But for the most part, I'm just not a fan of having just such a inefficient receiver garner 147 targets when you are one of the worst in the league in yards per target. It doesn't equate to efficient offense.
No.
I know, again, some of that has to do with Matt Canada. And then we look outside of the Steelers' top two, which I think their top two are fine. And George Pickens is going to be good. But when you dig deeper than that, it gets scary. We thought we would have Calvin Austin this year. That was a no. If not, then maybe some thought that Anthony Miller would make a difference. He was landed an IR in the preseason, never came back. You didn't get anything else from any of the other guys. Miles Boykin, Gunnar Olszewski, those are special teams players. Gunnar would get the occasional jet sweep, and that was about it. And then Steven Sims came on a little bit there at the end. But again, he wasn't very efficient when targeted this year either. And so you really need to see the Steelers probably draft another receiver in the second or third round next year. Ideally, I would say at the very least, if they don't go out and pay for one in free agency, because they just need more depth on this team. And I know they're getting Austin back. But it's hard to have too high of expectations for a fourth round rookie who missed his first full season on IR and is 5'7" 3/4. And so he's going to have a limited role in the NFL, even with as good of an athlete as he is. And I really like Calvin Austin, but we're going to go with a C- for Steelers receivers this year, potential to climb much higher next year. If Pickens takes another step, Johnson gets more consistent. And especially if they draft another receiver who can contribute like as that wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 4 for them. All right. What about tight end, Shane?
I'm going to give him a B. I think Pat was really good. He did have some injury issues. I think that kind of limited his overall numbers, but he was very good this year, of course, and he's probably our most consistent player on offense in general. You already kind of alluded to that earlier. Gentry played his role well. I really wish they would stop targeting him on screens, which, again, maybe that'll happen once Canada's gone. But other than that, I don't think he did anything egregious. He's a good backup tight end. And then Connor Hayward. He had some big plays for this team, and I think it's awesome to see, but like you could tell, like he's a true natural just receiver. He's not a great athlete. He's not a big guy, but every time he gets an opportunity to do something, it seems like he makes the play that he needs to make. And he might have the second best hands on the team, depending on how, Freiermuth had a couple drops this year, but he might have the second best hands on the team outside of Pickens. So it's going to be interesting to see what his role is moving forward. But, being listed tight end, he adds to that group. And I think really solid year for that group overall.
Yeah, the sample was relatively small, but he still ended up with almost 30 targets, I think, by the end of the season. Caught, I think, 21 of those passes, if I remember. He was very good, and I was surprised with him. I really was. And so, again, relatively small sample, but man, as your third tight end in his rookie season, you could do far worse than that. And I have hopes for him in moving forward that they're going to be able to use him because the guy just catches what you throw at him. And so, definitely an asset there. I'm going to go higher than you, Shane. I'm going to go with an A. I'm going to go with an A for the tight ends this year. And that's, I know that Freiermuth was injured a little bit in earlier in the season, had the concussion. He was on track, I think, to be right there, right in that tier behind Travis Kelce, maybe Mark Andrews. And then he's right there in the NFL, I think, if the guy just needs to stay healthy because he gets nicked up, it seems like a lot. We don't want these concussions to come back. That was the second of his career so far.
Yeah.
And then again, the knee injury during the last game that knocked him out of the game in the second half. But I do think that Freiermuth is going to be a stud. I really do think he's probably going to be a top 5 tight end in this league, assuming he can stay healthy. I think Gentry he's kind of like your prototype Y tight end as the inline blocker. And I agree with you, Shane. Why are we throwing screens to a 6'8", 265-pound tight end so often? I'm not sure. But I do think that he serves that role really well. I believe that Gentry has an expiring contract this year. So it'll be interesting to see what the Steelers do with him. Yeah, he was 2019 draft class. So I think that they're going to want to bring him back because he fits that role so well. And I can't imagine him getting paid a ton of money. And then, like you said, using Hayward as that H-back type tight end as your third tight end. That's I think that's a deep class. I think that they had a really good season overall. I think that was one of the strongest positional groups on the team, if not the strongest this year from the Steelers. All right, let's shift gears here, and we're going to go to the offensive line. Let's look at offensive tackle. From a strong group to maybe a relatively weak group, Shane, what do you have?
I gave him a D+. I think that a core 4 is an average tackle, which is fine in the NFL. I think he still played like that, and maybe he never is better than that, but it is what it is with him. That's kind of what he is. But Dan Moore just didn't really progress, and I think it's unfortunate because I was having hope that maybe they wouldn't have to invest, heavily in offensive line. They could get away with the 4th round picks, the 5th round picks, but he's not a starting left tackle. I think he's a really great swing tackle. We've talked about that a lot for him, but I really think that this is one of the positions that probably needs targeted in the first round, ideally. I don't really think you can really
Yeah.
upgrade heavily in free agency this year without spending a ton of money with the tackle position. And if you don't do it in the first round, you got to do it very early in the draft, if nothing else. So it was tough to watch at times with Moore. Wasn't terrible the entire year. He had some decent games, but between penalties, other things, he's really the one that I think they definitely need to replace next year if they want to get to that next tier of offensive line play.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you there. I'm going to go same exact D+ for Steelers offensive tackles. And I think that, I mean, you ask some people, they were fine. And especially in the second half of the season, they'll say, well, they played well enough. They supported the offensive line well enough. The running game was working well enough. And the running game was good, but the offensive tackles were doing their part. I don't think we can look at it like that, Shane. I think we have to compare. We have to cross compare. We have to look at the Steelers starting offensive tackles compared to the starting offensive tackles on every other team. And when we do that, we can say, yeah, they're worse. I mean, they're worse than just about any other unit out there. And I know that they're young and there's room for improvement. I don't think that I would award that opportunity to Dan Moore after 2 years, going into his third season. I mean, the guy was a 4th round pick. I don't think we should expect any more than what he's already given this team. And you know my thoughts on this. I like Dan Moore as a swing tackle. If you look at him for what he is, and you said, I spent a 4th round pick in the draft, I got a high quality swing tackle who can come in, play left tackle, maybe some right tackle, maybe even compete with the core four. That's fine. That's well worth that pick. But if I'm trying to pigeonhole my 4th rounder into being a premier left tackle that's going to be here throughout Kenny Pickett's tenure, that's not a good way of looking at things. It's not a position that you settle at. And I agree that needs to be upgraded. I agree with you as well that a core 4 was pretty serviceable in that role. He had his ups and downs as well. I thought that his first half of the season was probably a little bit more consistent than the second half of the year. But he's fine in that role. Eventually, Shane, I would like the Steelers to replace both offensive tackles, but they don't grow on trees, and it's not easy to do. You have to spend high draft capital, and I am really hoping that the Steelers are seriously looking into that. Now, they have Andy Weidel, who has really valued the offensive line for the Philadelphia Eagles when he was there. That's just something that's so important. If you get Kenny Pickett that protection, if he has confidence that his left tackle is going to hold up and can hold the ball for another second, scan the field, and not have to feel like he needs to flee the pocket so quickly, I think that's going to do wonders for his career path. So I don't think it was a great season overall. We're going to go D+ with the offensive tackles. All right, let's look at the interior offensive line. So we're going to group the centers and the guards here together. Shane, what do you have for the collection of Kevin Dotson, Mason Cole, James Daniels?
I'm actually willing to go as high as a B with them. I think Cole was a very good pickup as a center. He played very well throughout the year overall. Center is always kind of a high variance position, but I think he played his role very well for us. Dotson had his ups and downs for sure, and he's the one guy that going into next year, if you want to replace, I totally understand. But even he had some really good performances down the stretch. And then James Daniels was as advertised. I think he was very good, especially after the first few weeks getting acclimated. He really bought into offensive line coach Pat Meyer's system of how he likes to do everything. I think you could really tell that he came into his own down the stretch for us as well. And the run game really speaks for itself with those three especially. And overall, I'm not going to be concerned, at least, if we don't address that position in the offseason, although I would, again, understand if maybe you want to try to upgrade from Dotson or maybe even Cole if you don't want to rely on him doing it in 2 years in a row. But
yeah, I agree with you there. I'm going to give it the same grade, Shane. I think that the interior offensive line was decent this year. I mean, as well as we could have expected for the Steelers doing what they did and getting some mid-level free agent, at least spending mid-level money. I was really big fan of the James Daniels signing.
Yeah, for sure.
Back at the time, I was thrilled about that pick because they were getting a young, athletic guy who was just on a really awful football team. And James Daniels, I think, is a good player. I don't think that there's going to be anybody that argues and says, no, he wasn't their best offensive lineman this year, because I think as the overall sample, he was. And then again, I wasn't a big fan of the Mason Cole signing, but it actually worked out better than I thought it would for Pittsburgh. Certainly a massive step forward from what you saw from Kendrick Green last year, who just could not anchor. And so that pick just still bothers me a little bit. But Mason Cole did a good job in that role. And we look at Kevin Dotson. I think that in certain games, Kevin Dotson is the best of the five on the offensive line because he has the traits. He's got that huge barrel-chested body, the long arms, the power to just drive people and to anchor in pass protection. But unfortunately, he's also, him and Dan Moore, I would call them the most high variance on the offensive line, where the lows are really low. We saw a lot of penalties from Dotson. We saw some of those plays where it's just like somebody disconnected. They pulled the plug on him for a second and then he connected back in. And it's like, the guy's already passed you. What are you doing? He didn't block the guy that was in front of you. And so just some of those boneheaded type plays. Dotson, if the highs would stay high, I'm perfectly fine with leaving Dotson as the left guard.
For sure.
It's just that when you're going into age 27 season, he was an older prospect coming out. And so when we're already at this point and saying, all right, this is a guy we're going to have to look at paying down the line. He's already maybe halfway through his career. I don't know. We'll see how long it lasts. Do you go and spend good capital there? And that's why, Shane, I think it's going to be really interesting if Steelers look at like the Peter Skoronski's type of prospect this year, a guy that can play tackle, can play guard. He's going to have really short arms, and that concerns me because I do like to meet those thresholds on the outside. But
Ideally,
at the very least, when you have a guy that's so good at tackle in college, you can feel pretty confident if you could kick him inside to guard that he's going to be a good football player. And so maybe the Steelers will look at one of those versatile chess pieces that can kind of do a little bit of everything. Because like you said, maybe Dotson's a guy they look to replace and maybe he's not. I think that there's certainly more pressing needs. But again, pretty high variance player, pretty good grade overall though from Shane and I on the interior offensive line. Let's shift and we're going to look at the defense here. What about the interior defensive line, Shane?
I'm going to give him a B, and only because it's really based on two people, right?
Yeah.
If you go off of just Cam Hayward and Larry Ogunjobi seasons, you could give them an A for sure. Hayward had one of his better seasons again, 10.5 sacks, tons of tackles for loss. Really good season. Ogunjobi had a better season than I would have expected from him. It was kind of just a street free agent. That was because of his physical that was failed with the Bears. Like, he had a really good season, but it's kind of everyone after that makes me go, I don't know if you can really give him an A, because they didn't have a lot of depth in terms of quality players, that played quality snaps. Alu had his issues, is now 36 years old, I think, or 35. He didn't return to form. Marvin Leal had his moments, but again, he kind of had to play edge for this team at times because of the injuries there. So he didn't really get a full season as a true defensive lineman. It was just kind of all over the place besides those two. So even though it was really strong for those two guys, I do have to settle for a B, I think, for them.
Yeah, I'm going to go even a little bit lower than you, Shane. I'm going to go C+ with the interior defensive line. And I think it really is Hayward that is salvaging that grade for me. I do think that Ogunjobi had a pretty solid season. He was certainly the second best. I don't think anybody is going to argue of the interior defenders. He was certainly the second best on the team, but there is just a significant drop from Hayward to the next best guy. And Ogunjobi had some really strong games, some really nice pass rushes. But I do think in some ways he's a little bit like the Kevin Dotson of the defense, where he was also very high variance too. He got washed out of run plays a lot. He wasn't consistent enough game to game. And so I'm going to say, like, if I was just grading off of Hayward gets an A, maybe A+, because there's only what you can count on one hand, probably the guys that you would rather take at that position in the league over top of him. But again, the rest of the unit was incredibly weak. I wasn't pleased with what I saw from Isaiah Loudermilk, unfortunately, when he was in the game. I wanted to see more. You want those young guys on rookie contracts, especially a guy that's big and tall like he is. You want him to be able to help fill that role and that loss that we had with Stephon Tuitt with his retirement and him not playing the previous season. I do think Leal is going to be able to do some of that, but he's a very different type of player. He's more of that penetrating 3 technique type. And again, he was on IR and he didn't play for much of the season. And so it'll be interesting to see what the Steelers have in him. But I thought that the group as a whole, if you look at outside of Cam Hayward, is probably one of the very weakest in the NFL, unfortunately. And so that is a position that I would not be surprised if the Steelers spent as high as a first-round pick on the offensive line, because they value it so much. And you think about it, they go from Aaron Smith and Brett Kiesel to Cameron Hayward and Stephon Tuitt. They don't have that counterpart to Hayward in place right now. Hayward's going to be 34 years old in May. And so you have to wonder, how much do the Steelers still value that? I know that Tomlin's going to. And if they value it enough, I mean, they could spend as high as a first or second round pick trying to help out in that regard. And it'll be interesting to see if Larry Ogunjobi comes back as well. We'll table that discussion for another time. But I'm going to go ahead and go with the C+ for the interior defensive line. Let's look at edge defenders this year, Shane. And my goodness, this one we could really say, if we split it in halves, not so pretty, but how would you grade it as a whole?
I'm going to again go with the B because whenever
Okay.
TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith were filled together, they were an A. These two
Yeah.
together are fantastic. Highsmith had a great individual season in his own right, regardless of what being out or not. That was fantastic. But outside of those two, you got basically nothing out of this group. Again, I already alluded to the fact that Marvin Leal had to play edge a little bit at one point just because they need somebody out there who has done it before, and at least he has in college. It got really ugly outside of Highsmith when Watt was out. There was no pressure being put on except for basically by the interior defensive line and Highsmith. So I even hesitate to give them a B, but just because I'll give him a little bit of leeway because Watt was missing most of the year. When he got back, it did get better, but without him, it was definitely very ugly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that one, it's hard because the second half of the year was really strong. The first half of the year was incredibly weak. And so I'm going to go with a B minus, Shane. I'm real close to you here.
Fair. Yeah.
Just because Malik Reed was, when he had to start, he was the worst starting edge in the NFL by a mile, in my opinion, just because the guy could not get pressure. He could not get pressure on the quarterback. And it was like having 10 guys out there at times. And so I was so frustrated by that. I didn't expect a lot. I mean, Reed he's not a good athlete. He's undersized. He did have some sack production with the Broncos previously, but we didn't see any of that with the Steelers. It was just a pretty bad season overall. And man, if you look at one position, I mean, we'll talk about this as well sometime, but for as much as the Steelers spent on TJ Watt and making sure that you've got the defensive player of the year, you paid him at the time the most money of any defensive player in the NFL. You do not have an insurance policy out for this guy. That'd be like buying a mansion and not putting insurance on your house. And so it's so frustrating to me that they didn't do that. They had it the previous year with Melvin Ingram. We know how that ended. He forced his way out the door before the trade deadline. If they could get that Melvin Ingram type of guy in there who is going to be content in that role, and the Steelers are going to be willing enough to rotate the guys in, which is I think what they probably should have done anyway when they had Ingram, was rotate more, keep everybody fresh. That's just my opinion. But they need that third guy, and they do not have him right now. Malik Reed was pretty awful. But again, the second half of the season, very good by Watt and Highsmith. Watt wasn't as productive as he normally is, still recovering. He just said it was last week or the week before that he's finally feeling healthy again. And that makes sense because when you miss 8 weeks with a pec injury, you had arthroscopic knee surgery, and then you were dealing with a rib injury shortly after that, you're not going to be the same. I would expect TJ Watt to return mostly or fully to form by next season. And then we'll see a really dominant duo, I think, next year. One that can maybe earn an A+ for us. We'll see if they stay healthy. Let's go to linebackers, Shane, these off the ball linebackers. And yikes. Is this I mean, it's got to be offensive tackle or linebacker, right? What is the weakest position on this team?
I gave it to linebacker. I give them a D, and I only didn't give them an F or a D- just because the linebacker play is kind of has high variance across the league sometimes, and it's not the most important position on the field depending on your defense. But you just didn't get a lot out of this group. I think everybody kind of played on a similar level. Spillane ended up being the most consistent, if you want to call him consistent, but just none of these guys, Bush obviously and Jack, they should be the ones who, would have been the guys to make this a decent linebacking group. But by the end of the season, neither of those guys were really looking like starting caliber players, especially Bush. He didn't even really play much in the year. You have to assume his time with Pittsburgh is over. Spillane, again, he played the most overall, but he still isn't a good player. I mean, you watch him try to run after guys and he's stuck in the mud. He just doesn't have the athleticism. They need an entire overhaul of this group. I think that if you bring Spillane back on like a small deal just to be the second linebacker, Robinson, hopefully he develops into hopefully who is the second linebacker moving into the future. But you have to address this position. I don't know if it's in free agency. I don't know if it's in the draft. If it is in the draft, don't do it in the first 2 rounds at least, because that just doesn't work out for teams usually. But if you are going to address it, it's got to be some point this offseason, whether it's in the draft or free agency.
Yeah, Shane, I'm going to give it an F. I'm going to give it a
That's fair. It's totally fair.
And I'm going to give it for the reasons that I said before is if we look at this linebacker group compared to other teams around the league, I would trade it for anybody's. Trade it for anybody's because the fact that Robert Spillane got to play the most, and again, it's Tomlin. He's covers linebacker, I guess. I don't know. But he's always out on the field. Yeah, I want my 4.8 speed linebacker always out on the field. I don't know. But I would trade it for any other unit. And the fact that Spillane played so much when the Steelers spent a combined first, second, and third round pick on Devin Bush, and you spent a ton of money on, I mean, not a ton of money. You spent good money on Myles Jack in free agency. His cap hit, because the way it was structured, is supposed to go up to over 11.2 million next year,
Yeah, that
for the
ain't
Steelers, which is
happening
absurd. No. And so the fact that those guys couldn't beat out Robert Spillane, at least in favor of the coaching staff, it's incredibly disheartening. Like these last two games to close out the season, Devin Bush had 5 snaps in each. 5 snaps for the guy that you spent more draft capital on, and I don't remember how long. And so it's just so frustrating to see. And obviously that didn't turn out. He's not coming back. He fell out of favor. He's done. He doesn't want to be here, I'm sure, after not being able to play and not being able to get on the football in late in the season. And so, and I don't think that Myles Jack should be, if it's up to me, he's gone right now. Like there's no reason to keep him around. I'm not even contemplating tacking voidable years onto a 27-year-old linebacker who had degenerative knees coming into the NFL. And not that has been a major issue for him, but certainly not the fast type of player that we saw coming into the league. I mean, that's not his game anymore. He's more of that true buck role where you need to be at and near the line of scrimmage. And so not at all what I wanted. Can't say it's not what I expected, because it pretty much was, more or less. But I'm going to give it an F because, like I said, I think I would trade it for any other group in the league. I'm not so sure, Shane, the Steelers even have a linebacker on the team that we should consider an average NFL starter. I don't even know if they have that. I think they're all totally below average. Yeah. Totally so that's one position I want revamped, but don't do it in the first round. Like you said, it just doesn't work out. You can kind of look at the analytics of that, just like drafting running backs in the first round. It typically doesn't work out. Day 2 is the sweet spot. I'm hoping that's where the Steelers go to get their linebacker help. And there's been opportunities in the past, Pete Werner, those type of guys. You have to be willing to kind of pull the trigger on a second, third round linebacker. So we'll see if they end up doing that. Let's go ahead and look at cornerbacks, Shane. Lots of injuries at the cornerback position this year, especially Kella Witherspoon only ended up playing like 4 or 5 games all season long with that hamstring injury. It's ended up being pretty severe. It's some interesting decisions what they had in their secondary, the decision to go out and trade for a cornerback right before the deadline too, and William Jackson. And so how would you grade the cornerbacks this year?
Overall, I'm going to give them a C, because I think Sutton was a very good player, and I hope he's back for sure. We'll talk more about that, like you said, when we get to free agency and things like that. But I definitely hope he's back. He was the only truly above average corner on this team. But then you look at Levi Wallace. He had some ugly moments, but overall he had good ball production. He was able to hold it down as a second corner for most of the year. James Pierre played better in spots than I would have expected based on last year. It was just I think it was an average group overall. They weren't terrible. Yeah. They were below average in terms of their athleticism, and that's part of the problem. And that's why you need to address it regardless. But I think overall, their overall how they played was not as bad as maybe it was early in the season. I think it definitely got a little bit better down the stretch once the pass rush especially came back into the fray there.
Yeah, not the weakest positional group, but I understand why it's being mocked so often to the Steelers, because outside of Cam Sutton, you really don't have that guy. Like, I think that Levi Wallace is best as your number 3 corner. If he's that and he can come in and play a little boundary, then I like him better in that role than being forced into being the number 2 cornerback, because I just don't think he has the complete enough skill set for that. He was able to take the ball away a little bit this year, which helped, but I thought Sutton was excellent. Overall, I'm going to give this group a C-. And the reason for that is because when they played good quarterbacks, they were shredded. I mean, they were shredded badly. In Buffalo Bills and Josh Allen, and both games against Cincinnati. And they did have a lot of takeaways the first Cincinnati game, but they gave up a lot of big plays. Like James Pierre, if James Pierre only had to cover between 10 and 50 yards, he'd be
great.
Bowler.
Yeah, he'd be awesome. He's awesome.
But when you have to cover beyond that and you have 4.6 speed and you're not disciplined enough, he gives up a lot of big plays too. And that's what we've seen with him throughout his career. And so some impressive plays by everybody, but not a big enough, collective enough sample to say I'm comfortable with this person outside of Sutton. And obviously Sutton is he has an expiring contract. The Steelers are going to need to lock him up, because you don't lock up Sutton, you've got nobody that you can trust at the cornerback position. Akella Witherspoon is under contract. It'll be interesting to see what the Steelers do with him. If they don't think that he's healthy or they didn't like what they saw, maybe they'll just try to save a few bucks by releasing him this offseason. I would like to, for the price that he's under right now, I would like to give him one more chance at that contract. I think that they probably should. He's only got one more year left on it, and I don't think he's the future. But I think that if we see him healthy, and he did have that rough stretch before he had the hamstring injury, but he had a really good 6-game stretch last year to close out the season. So it'll be interesting to see what they do there. I do think they need to invest, and they need to invest pretty high, because when you're taking corners in the 3rd, 4th, 5th round, you can't expect them to come in and be much more than special teams players. And so unfortunately, it is a high risk, high reward position.
You're muted, Tommy, I think.
Sorry, I must have hit a button there. It's an
Yeah.
important position, but one, if you're not investing high, you're just going to keep kind of going with the same thing that they've already been doing year after year. You're just going to go find a free agent fill in, and you're never going to be good enough to really be able to kind of slow down some of these top tier quarterbacks. And that's what we're seeing. So yeah, low grade from me from the cornerback position, not as low as I give the linebackers, and about the same as what I would give the Steelers offensive tackles this year, but in that tier, third, probably the 2nd or 3rd worst positional group on the team this year, in my opinion. All right, Shane, safeties. What do you got for us this year for the safeties?
Got to give him an A, right? Mika's going to be first team All-Pro. He was already voted by the players in that player vote recently that just came out. He was
NFLP.
Yeah, he was voted as first team All-Pro. If he's not the best safety in the NFL, he's one of the first 3 guys that should come out of your mouth. I mean, that's just kind of what it is. And then I don't really need to talk about him too much. We kind of already know what he brings. And then Terrell Edmunds, when he was on, he was on. Like, he was a very good player for them this year overall. I really want to see him come back, have that safety deal for the next 3 or 4 years. If you give him not a huge contract, he won't garner enough interest for that. But if you can get him on like a 3-year deal that's really reasonable, you won't really have to worry about safety, at least the starting guys, after that for a couple of years. And then when KZ came back, he also made some plays. I'd like to see him return as well. So that would be huge as well. If you can have those as your 3 safeties, you don't really have to worry about that position next year. I think that's, if it's not the strongest position on the team, it's second best. And I think that edge, whenever they're healthy, might be stronger, but safety's right behind him at this point.
Yeah, Shane, if Edmunds didn't have a 3 or 4 game stretch where he was maybe playing at a below average level, and if KZ didn't get injured, I might give this group an A+. But I'm going to go with you, and I'm going to give it an A, because I do think the Steelers have the most valuable safety in the league, and Minka Fitzpatrick tied with the league 6 interceptions. And it just so valuable. I mean, and a selfless player too, because he had the pick where he easily could have made it into the end zone. He chose to step out of bounds like 4 yards short. And I'm like, okay. I mean, either way, I think we're going to win that football game at that point. So, I mean, you're not being selfish if you want to just, dive into hit the pylon, whatever. But I mean, can't say enough about him. Obviously one of the top 3 players on the team. That's been the case since 2019. Last year was maybe a little bit down. He didn't get the takeaways last year, a little bit less consistent, but he's really picked up his game, especially as a run supporter. I think he's been excellent there. And now you truly have the complete package with him. You got a guy that can take the ball away as well as anyone in the league, and somebody who can come up and support the run as well as any player at that position. And so love what we're getting with Fitzpatrick. He's on a Hall of Fame pace. I mean, so he was voted first team All-Pro by the NFL Players Association, which I think this might be their first year of doing that.
I think so. Yeah. I don't remember it before. Yeah.
But I fully expect him to be first team All-Pro by the Associated Press, which is the one for sure that everybody tallies year to year. That would be his 3rd. And again, that benchmark for the Hall of Fame, typically you're looking at, if you get 4 to 5 All-Pros, you're right in that discussion. He's well on track to do that. And to get his 4th, I mean, he'll have it before the halfway point of his career at this rate. And so definitely pleased with what we saw from him this year. Edmunds, I think just a strong overall player. If the guy could take the ball away, he'd be more valuable than he is.
Sure. If he could have,
I think he improved as a blitzer, as a run defender.
Yeah.
Still a little bit stiff, I think, in coverage at times, but the length and the speed helps out so much. And then Diontae KZ, when you have a 3rd safety that can come in, who is a ball hawk the way that he is, I love it. I mean, I want the Steelers to bring back this group next year.
Yes, 100%.
Don't spend a 2nd or 3rd round pick on a safety, because you're not going to get probably any better than what you have right now. Get those guys back on the cheap. You might be able to get Edmunds, KZ for maybe $3-4 million each, somewhere in that ballpark. But I think it's worth it to bring that group back collectively. Maybe they're a little bit cheaper than that. Edmunds went for cheaper than that last year. So we'll see what it ends up being, but I'm a very big supporter of this group. In my opinion, if we count that really bad stretch of the edge play this year with Malik Reed in there, which I think that we have to, I think that tight end and I think that safety were the 2 strongest positional groups on the team, in my opinion, because I think that they've got the depth and they've got the top end talent at both of those. One more for us, Shane, and we're going to sign off as one of our longer shows.
Oh yeah.
Let's just do special teams, and then we'll do our sign off for today.
Yeah, so not the best way to end off, in my opinion. Special teams were rough this year. I gave him a D. I think that the kicking game when Boswell wasn't in there, and even when he got back, because you could tell kind of dealing with the leg injury, like it just wasn't the same as it was last year. And obviously, I think Boswell will bounce back overall next year in terms of percentage of kicks he hits, and some of that was also bad decisions by Tomlin kicking the ball. I'm not gonna lie, I can't really blame Boswell for some of that. Harvin just. He's still a below average punter. I don't know if he'll ever not be a below average punter. That might be something we have to address. Honestly, it's unfortunate. I like the guy. I think he can. Some of his punts are beautiful. It's just some of them are definitely not. And then we didn't really get much out of the return game. Our special teams tackling and our ability to avoid returns, that was definitely good. I think Boykin was one of the best special teamers in the league. But outside of him, there really wasn't a lot of true standout special teams moments from the season.
Yeah, I think the coverage unit was all right on special teams. But again, Boswell did not have that same year. I'm going to go ahead and give the Steelers a D+ for special teams. And because I think that Harvin is just so inconsistent still.
Yeah.
I know he got a little bit more consistent as the season went on. Boswell, I think he kicked is either in the upper 60s or lower 70s%, which is a big drop from what it was before. But as you said already, Shane, some of that was decision making. It was when you're choosing to kick the ball in the wind. Sometimes you're down in distance, and I think that a lot of those Steelers should have went for it on 4th and 2, 4th and 3 instead, and then that's one less missed field goal that Boswell has. But he did have some misses on the season that factors in. And then when you look at Gunnar Olszewski got benched as the return man because of his fumbles, and then Steven Sims fumbled a few times as well in his own right, and so. Just not enough consistency from this group yet. There were highs, but the lows were pretty low. And so I don't have a great grade for special teams this year. We're not going to get to coaching today. We'll leave that for a different segment. Shane, we're going to talk about Steelers coaching. We've got lots to talk about this offseason. Super excited about some of the things to come here. And we'll see if any news comes out before this next season. Maybe Matt Canada won't be with us any longer.
Hopefully.
But who knows? That'll be hopeful thinking. We're going to sign off for today. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Steel Curtain Podcast. You can follow Shane on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download your podcast wherever you get your podcasts and check us out on YouTube. Thanks for listening to the Steel Curtain Podcast.